The Dark Scrolls. No one walking along the cobbled streets of 19th century England could fail to notice the spectacle that sometimes unfolded in the open air of a village marketplace. A man leading his wife on a rope, like livestock. Some people pretended not to stare, others jeered openly, drawn by the grotesque curiosity of the moment. A few clutched their children's hands a little tighter, silently wondering whether this was the sign of a society losing its last shred of decency. But for the man with the rope in his fist and the woman shuffling beside him with her face pale and blank, this was no cheap performance. It was an improvised ritual, public, humiliating, but perversely necessary, because, to them, this was the only way out. To understand how such a scene could ever have existed, you have to set aside the modern assumption that marriage is fundamentally a private bond, entered for love and dissolved, if need be, by the relatively straightforward processes of civil law. In early Victorian England, marriage was first and foremost a binding contract, intertwined with property, inheritance, and social standing. Once you were locked inside it, there was no easy exit. Divorce was not merely uncommon, it was reserved for the wealthiest and most influential. Only Parliament could grant it. The price of a private act of Parliament was so ruinous that few even bothered to dream about affording it. For a working man, a mill hand, a shepherd, a miner, or a day laborer, divorce was a phantom. Yet human beings will always search for ways to slip out of cages, however elaborate those cages may be. And so, in towns and villages across the country, a peculiar workaround emerged: wife selling. To outsiders, especially to modern observers, it sounds grotesque. It seems unthinkable that a husband could lead his wife into a livestock market, stand beside her on the auction block, and hawk her to the highest bidder. But in the eyes of those desperate men and women, it was the only accessible exit. They considered it, in a grim and approximate sense, a form of divorce. Imagine the early hours of a Thursday market in Yorkshire or Dorset. There is the smell of damp straw, spilled ale, manure, and fried bread. Merchants shout about their wares: bolts of coarse wool, iron pots, pickled eggs, and barley. And then comes a different cry, pitched higher, more embarrassed, almost defiant. "Gentlemen, this here's my lawful wife. She is to be sold with her own consent. Who'll make an offer?" Those standing nearby would step closer, the same way people are drawn to accidents. The woman might wear her best shawl, her hair carefully combed, her children, if any, standing in a tight little cluster at her skirts. Sometimes the husband would write up a notice and pin it to her dress, specifying her age, health, and disposition. Occasionally, the document included a complaint. "She has a sharp tongue," or "she keeps a clean house but has no affection." Other times, it was the woman herself who insisted on being sold, determined to escape a brutal home. For them, this wasn't simply an act of despair. It was also an assertion of agency in a society that permitted them almost none. Contemporary observers left scattered records describing these transactions. They appear in parish registers, newspaper columns, and personal diaries. Though it was never formally legal, wife-selling was tolerated by many local communities, so long as it was performed publicly, witnessed by neighbors, and followed by a handshake or the passing of a few coins. This was the ritual that made it binding, the ritual that, so they believed, could cleanse them of obligations to each other. A man named Samuel Whitehead, a farm laborer in Staffordshire, sold his wife Mary for a single shilling and a quart of ale. Witnesses recorded that she appeared not displeased, having already agreed to live with the buyer, a weaver named William Hargreaves. In other accounts, the transaction was more brutal, the woman weeping as the rope changed hands. Each of these episodes illuminates the grim calculations people made under economic pressure. When your life was defined by your poverty and your inability to change it, you grabbed hold of any escape, even one that made you an object on display. It is easy, standing in our own century, to recoil. But the Victorian working class did not have the luxury of modern legal protections or generous social safety nets. A husband who could no longer bear the costs of supporting a wife, or who suspected she had taken a lover, could not simply walk away. A wife whose husband drank his wages or beat her could not easily find sanctuary. The workhouse loomed over everyone, a place of hunger, disease, and shame. To avoid it, a woman might submit to being sold to a man who promised to feed her children and spare her the worst degradations of poverty. And so the markets continued. The very strangeness of the custom was part of what made it effective. Because it was so public, so theatrical, the whole community witnessed it. And that collective witnessing gave the ritual a curious power. Even if the law did not recognize the sale, the neighbors did. Once the rope passed from one man's hand to another's, it was understood, often without question, that the transaction was final. In this way, a marketplace became a kind of court. The crowd became the judge, the jury, and the notary public, stamping an improvised divorce decree with their stares. It is worth pausing here to remember that many of the men who sold their wives did not see themselves as monsters. They were, in their own estimation, upholding a rough code of fairness. They offered the woman her say. Sometimes she consented, sometimes she did not, and they made sure everyone could see it. To them, it was the most dignified solution they could afford, and for many of the women, as grim as it sounds, it was preferable to any alternative. No legislation explicitly prohibited wife selling until the middle of the 19th century. Even then, the authorities were reluctant to interfere. When the newspapers reported these sales, the tone was often scandalized, but there was rarely any legal consequence. Officials understood that enforcing the letter of marriage law would only drive such transactions into the shadows. So the spectacle continued, an open secret in a society that prized appearances but failed to offer its poorest citizens any legal relief. In the next part of this story, you will see how these sales evolved, from a desperate improvisation to a widespread, semi-accepted custom, and how they began to draw the attention of reformers, novelists, and scandal-hungry journalists. But before that, consider this. Beneath the marketplace din, beneath the shouts and the jeers, there was something else, a collective acknowledgement that the institution of marriage itself was broken for those who could least afford its demands. If you walked into an English tavern in the 1830s and asked a few working men whether wife-selling was real, you'd hear the same sheepish laugh, the same shrug of resignation. Of course it was real. Everyone had heard of someone, a cousin, a neighbor, a drinking companion who'd done it. Sometimes it happened in a quiet corner of the local market. Other times it became a public spectacle that drew crowds from miles around, like a fairground attraction with the unsettling twist that a human life hung in the balance. By the early Victorian period, these transactions had become both notorious and strangely commonplace. In rural counties, Somerset, Yorkshire, Staffordshire, records show dozens of cases every decade. Some towns developed a reputation for the practice, as if the custom took root in the soil and refused to be dug out. Over time, certain protocols emerged, a set of expectations that gave the sales a thin veneer of legitimacy. First came the notice. Often the husband would write out a crude placard on brown paper, pinning it to his wife's back or front so the crowd could read it. The wording was usually blunt. For sale, my wife Sarah, aged 27, sober, industrious, free of disease. Sometimes there was a note about temperament, has a bitter tongue, or docile and clean, as if she were a horse to be inspected. The most humiliating part, many witnesses said, was not the rope itself, but the appraisal, the sensation of dozens of eyes roaming over a body that until then had belonged only to her husband. Next came the auctioneer's call. In the smallest markets, the husband himself cried out the offers. In larger towns, an actual auctioneer might step in, treating the sale no differently than the livestock lots. He would wave his hammer, announce the price, urge the bidders higher. The sums varied wildly, sometimes as little as sixpence, sometimes a guinea or more if the woman was young or her new partner had means. There are even records of cases where a friendly landlord paid the price, simply to rescue the woman from her circumstances. At the heart of it all was the belief, half superstition, half desperation, that if the sale was public enough, witnessed by enough people, it could serve as a legal dissolution. No statute ever enshrined this idea, but folklore did. The law, the real law, was mostly silent, and silence is fertile ground for myths. So, when the transaction concluded, money paid, rope passed from hand to hand, sometimes with a drink to seal it, everyone involved believed they had achieved something binding. The husband was no longer responsible for her debts. The wife no longer owed him her company. The buyer became the new spouse, or something like it. It was in this climate of tacit acceptance that social critics and novelists began to take notice. To them, wife selling was both an outrage and a symptom, evidence of the moral decay lurking beneath Britain's glittering industrial wealth. They could not understand how a society that built railways, invented machinery, and sang hymns to progress could tolerate such an archaic, dehumanizing ritual. Among the earliest to write about it was a traveling magistrate, Charles Mainwaring, who documented a sale in Worcestershire in the 1820s. He described the scene in almost forensic detail. The damp courtyard behind an inn, the woman in a faded blue dress, the ring of spectators. He was struck not just by the act itself, but by the eerie calm with which everyone accepted it. There was no outcry, no protest, he wrote. It was as if each person present had silently agreed that the law did not reach them here. In 1832, the Times published a scandalized report of a wife sale in Smithfield Market, London, a place more famous for cattle than for human commerce. The story described the husband leading his wife through the streets with a halter of twisted straw. He declared she was no longer of any use to him, then struck a deal with a butcher who had been courting her. The price? 1 sovereign and the promise to settle her debts at the tavern. The newspaper's editor thundered that this was an outrage against civilization itself, proof that England's working poor were little removed from savagery. But the truth was more complicated than the righteous editorials suggested. Not every wife was an unwilling victim. In some cases, she had demanded the sale. The rituals may have been humiliating, but they offered a rare opportunity for choice, a kind of agency denied in almost every other sphere of life. If a woman was trapped with a drunkard or a brute, wife-selling could be the lesser evil. In an age when the law offered no divorce for the poor, this was sometimes the only way to reclaim a measure of control over her destiny. Still, there were plenty of cases in which the woman had no say at all. The line between consent and coercion was never clear, and each transaction existed on a spectrum of desperation. It was this ambiguity that fascinated novelists and moralists alike. In 1886, Thomas Hardy wove the practice into his novel The Mayor of Casterbridge, in which Michael Henchard sells his wife Susan at a country fair. Hardy understood that to condemn the act outright was too simple. He showed how poverty and powerlessness could twist even ordinary men into committing acts they never imagined. Henchard is not a monster. He is a man broken by his own failures, reaching for a solution he will regret until he dies. The more the press wrote about wife-selling, the more it seeped into the popular imagination. Punch magazine published cartoons mocking the practice, drawing husbands standing beside their wives as if they were fattened pigs. Moral reform societies cited the stories as proof that England was sliding into barbarism. Politicians wrung their hands, promising investigations that never materialized, and still the sales continued. They were too deeply woven into the fabric of working-class life to vanish overnight. In part, the persistence of the custom reflected the profound mismatch between Britain's legal ideals and its social realities. Parliament believed it had outlawed the sale of wives centuries earlier, when marriage laws became more formalized. But in the villages and market towns where the poorest lived, those laws were abstract. What mattered was what the neighbors believed, and the neighbors believed that a public sale absolved the husband and bound the new partner. It was an informal contract, sanctified by nothing more than the gaze of the crowd. This gap between written law and lived experience is one of the reasons why wife-selling fascinates historians. It exposes how power can work in the shadows, how communities can create their own rituals when institutions fail them. It reminds us that poverty is not just an absence of money, it is an absence of choices. By the time the mid-19th century arrived, public attitudes toward wife-selling began to shift. Industrialization was transforming England. Cities were growing, literacy was rising, and newspapers carried stories of scandal into every parlor and pub. What had once been a local secret was now a national embarrassment. Reformers seized on the issue, using it to argue that England needed better laws for the protection of the poor. Even those who had tolerated the practice began to feel a creeping shame. But change was slow. As late as the 1880s, wife sales still occurred, if less openly. One could find court records of men charged with disturbing the peace after attempting to sell their wives in a public square. Magistrates often expressed horror but passed only mild sentences. The social logic that had sustained the practice for so long did not disappear overnight. And yet, beneath the scandal and the condemnation, the same basic question remained. What would you do if the law refused to help you? If you were bound to someone you could no longer endure? If you lived in a world where no court would hear your plea? For many Victorians, wife-selling was their only answer, a tragic, imperfect, public attempt to reclaim the freedom the law denied. In the final part of this story, we will explore how the custom finally declined, the last recorded cases that flickered into the 20th century, and the legacy of humiliation and necessity that still lingers in Britain's memory. If you were to look through the old parish ledgers and magistrate reports from the final decades of the Victorian era, you would see how wife-selling began to flicker and die like a dying fire. But you would also see that even in its last moments, it still found ways to resurface, to humiliate and to liberate, sometimes in the same breath. In 1881, in Leeds, a woman named Hannah Blamires became the center of a final, small storm of public attention. Her husband, a laborer named Henry, marched her through the city market with a halter around her waist and offered her to the highest bidder. A small crowd gathered. Some laughed, others jeered, but a few stood in sullen silence. A local journalist recorded the scene and printed it in a scandal sheet the following day. The headlines were outraged. A sale of a wife in our Christian England. But if you look closer at the details, the story is more complicated. Hannah was willing. She had pleaded with Henry to end their marriage, and the man she was sold to was the lodger she already loved. In that sense, the ritual was less about cruelty than about desperation, an awkward, crude attempt to make a new life possible. Yet the fact that her freedom required a rope and a public auction spoke volumes about the indignities that poverty still imposed. That same year, a similar incident was reported in the Midlands, where a miner exchanged his wife for a sum of beer and a promise of maintenance payments. As late as 1901, newspapers in the North recorded a final known sale, carried out in the same fashion that would have been familiar to the generation before Victoria took the throne. Even as the century turned and the Edwardian era dawned, the old habits sometimes refused to die. Yet by then, the world around these desperate transactions was changing too fast to ignore. The Industrial Revolution had not only built railways and factories, it had also created new public conversations. Literacy was rising. Working men and women began reading daily papers that carried news far beyond their villages. Reformers had grown more determined to end the practice, convinced that it symbolized everything rotten about Britain's class divisions. Part of what killed wife selling was this rising tide of embarrassment. Local authorities, who once looked the other way, started to crack down. Clergymen thundered from pulpits about the shame it brought to English morals. Factory owners worried that the stories damaged Britain's image abroad. And women's rights advocates, many of whom were fighting for married women's property laws, seized on the image of the wife in a halter to press their case. If a married woman could be treated like cattle, they argued, then surely the laws needed to change. They were not wrong. The practice thrived in the cracks of a legal system that never intended to protect the poor. For centuries, marriage in England had been bound up with property and patriarchal control. A husband was entitled to his wife's earnings, her children, and her body. When Parliament had created the first meaningful divorce law in 1857, the Matrimonial Causes Act, it was still an institution shaped by class. Even then, a working man could scarcely afford the fees and paperwork to separate legally. Only as the 20th century unfolded did divorce begin to feel like a right rather than a privilege reserved for the rich. But the end of wife selling did not come with a single law or a clear date. It faded slowly, drowned by social progress and a growing sense of collective shame. As newspapers exposed the practice to the wider world, its defenders dwindled. What had once been framed as customary began to look barbaric, a relic of a darker age. By 1900, a man who tried to sell his wife was more likely to be arrested for public disorder or assault. The communities that once nodded in grim acceptance started to recoil. And yet, if you read the scattered testimonies left behind, you find that not everyone saw wife selling as an outrage. Some remembered it with bitter gratitude. For a few, it had been the only way to escape a violent home, to secure food for children, to start again without the weight of scandal. One old woman, interviewed by a journalist in 1910, recalled her own sale without tears. "It was the best bargain I ever made," she said. "Better to be sold than to starve." Such stories force us to wrestle with a hard truth, that what looks monstrous from a distance sometimes grew from necessity. When you have no lawful recourse, when poverty closes every door, you do whatever you can to survive. If the only path to freedom winds through public shame, some will still choose to walk it. Historians have since tried to tally how many sales took place over those centuries, but the records are patchy and incomplete. Some estimate that hundreds occurred between the late 16s and the dawn of the 20th century. Others argue the number was much higher, hidden in unrecorded village deals. What we know for certain is that the practice was not a myth or a marginal curiosity. It was a feature of life for the working class in an era that valued property more than personhood. Even as the custom died out, it left behind a cultural shadow. Writers like Thomas Hardy seized on the image of the woman led by a rope, her dignity stripped away, to symbolize the deeper cruelty of a society that claimed to be civilized. Reformers used it to shame Parliament into expanding divorce rights and improving protections for married women, and over time the old stories hardened into cautionary tales, reminders of how easy it is to rationalize oppression when the victims have no voice. Today, it is almost impossible to imagine a man standing in a marketplace, calling bids for his wife as neighbors watch. It seems grotesque, the stuff of caricature or grim folklore. But in the world of Victorian England, it was neither. It was an institution born of desperation, preserved by silence, and ended by the slow march of reform and shame. And if there is any lesson worth carrying forward, it is that poverty warps everything it touches. It can turn marriage, a union meant to be private and sacred, into a spectacle of humiliation. It can force people to pretend that a rope around a woman's waist is justice. It can make a market stall feel like the only courtroom that will hear your plea. In the end, wife-selling was less a story about cruelty than about the human instinct to survive at any cost. It was a ritual forged in the space between law and necessity. A relic, yes, but one that reminds us how fragile dignity can be when hunger, loneliness, and powerlessness crowd a life. Even as the last sales faded from the newspapers, their memory lingered. And it lingers still, an unsettling testament to what people will endure when they are given no better choice. It forces us to ask ourselves, if we had been born in those villages bound by the same poverty, the same invisible cages, what would we have done? Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.